speaking here on behalf of colleagues Ian Doherty and Sarah Swift as well, who contributed to this work. And you can see the title, Leading the Way to Lower Carbon Transport, How, When and Why Do Older, More Experienced Drivers Make a Change? So, before I start, why are we talking about older people and what do we mean by older people? Older people, definitely I fall into that category. We're thinking about roughly the boomer generations and beyond. Why? Well, firstly, there's a lot of them. Secondly, that's a generation that can act, if you like, as an extreme case. It's a generation that was born into automobility, that has its life woven around the car in many and complex ways. A lot of us have driven for decades and structured our lives around the car. Also though, there's potential there. As people who've lived with cars all of their lives, why do people demit car use, change their modal patterns? The scope for learning and scope for leadership from this generation. One of the fundamental issues of sustainability is that of justice and the idea of a just transition. And the ugly truth is, people like me and my cohort are a huge part of the problem. And the younger people we met in the hall today really have cleaning up on their shoulders. So, why are we doing what we're doing? Well, decarbonate, obviously, climate emergency, obviously, and the imperative to cut back on carbon emissions. We think of that broadly, not just the emissions that come from vehicles. Switching to electric vehicles will not solve our problem, and we still have embodied carbon over and above that. But we can't do no cars, can we? Our society is woven around them, our planning is woven around them. We've got to think about a just transition, what we can do. Cumbria, in a way, I'm from Scotland, you can probably hear from the accent, but we've got a lot of common ground. My university, the West of Scotland, has very, very urbanised bits, very, very rural bits further down the coast. So we share a lot of empathy with the issues you have here. In terms of methods, the approach we took was qualitative. We're interested in exploration of complex phenomena. We worked with people in the DecarboN8 area, and we took 3 strands. The first, we had a project website called, I hope gracefully, Older Wiser Drivers, and we hosted a qualitative survey on that. We did in-depth interviews with 4 transport sector professionals, and we also did a small group study online, which was related to advice from our transport sector professionals and who we should speak with. On the good news front, massive breadth of decarbonisation behaviours, even from a very, very small group of people. We just did 14 in the online survey. They talked about use, and they talked about type of vehicle. They talked about cessation, about hiring, about sharing, about replacing a car less frequently, about reducing the number of vehicles in a household, about giving lifts to people, more walking, more cycling, and the type of car, shifting to an EV, shifting to hybrid, lower emissions vehicles, and changing fuel type. So even with a small group, an awful lot of opportunities. One of the things we also asked to try and dig down into the idea of how important environmental attitudes were for these people, because we are dealing with a partial group, was to ask them effectively, how important is the environmental aspect of your driving to you? And we used the responses of that to classify people in particular ways. We're not working statistically here, but what did quite surprise us was, as well as what we would expect, people who were very or extremely concerned about the environmental impact of the car use, we had people who really said not at all, who said slightly. Again, a little bit surprising. We can see that in terms of good news, because change of behaviour and demitting of car use and taking on other types of mobility do not link firmly to environmental interest. One conclusion that you can draw from that is there's potentially more scope for societal readiness than we might expect. The two things don't tie together. We had interviewees who were very, very environmentally motivated, who had more than 1 car in the household and drove a lot. That might be a positive for us. In terms of what people actually did though, their behaviour was driven not by environmental commitment, although that was a feature, but by their perceptions of want, of need and convenience. Again, I'm going to rip briskly through some of these ideas. Firstly, the tipping point of need and want is very often related to land use and planning. Land use and planning is what, pardon the pun, drives behaviour. We may have amenities that allow people to function digitally, to have internet contact, but very often they want to see things, they want to do things, they want to meet people. Positive suggestions that our group made were we might ensure that housing developments are accompanied by essential services. This will be very familiar to you. It's like the litter thing. People want shops, they want bars, they want doctors' surgeries, they want to be able to get to them easily without any difficulty. Another idea was promoting the idea of accessibility in the state agency so that non-car modes were more non-car environments were more of a selling point for new residential developments. In terms of the bus, the big tipping point there was the calibre of the public transport. So even people who were motivated to use public transport, unless it was very good, they didn't, they stopped it, especially if they were with children. Another thing that I would pull out, and again, there was some talk about language this morning, was the use of language in our respondents. Again, we have a group of enthusiasts, people who are on board in the main with demitting car use and making compromises. The language was phenomenal. You are lucky if you live somewhere with good public transport. You're lucky if it's a reasonable level of public transport, if it's realistically served. Expectations are so modest, so poor just now. This is my active travel slide. Whole bunch of tires. Again, you would think with the group we're working with, they'd be very for walking, very for cycling. Well, up to a point. Recreationally, yes, but in terms of a transport mode, a lot of problems. Serious challenge to walking and cycling as viable transport modes. In some cases, this was because of infrastructure, but mostly it was around ideas of competition with the car and risk. Quick quotation. Somebody who describes himself as being a long-term cyclist from a cycling family. Quite recently, after all the lockdown, I find I was quite frightened because on a road I've never been in for years, a huge articulated lorry passed me. It must have been a foot away. And I thought, you know, I'm literally inches from death here. That's stopped me cycling. I'm done. So, very often, the car is seen as success. The car is seen as success within this group. There's a perception that cycling is despised. We can address the meaning of the car in many ways in different places, and we have to think about place when we're communicating ideas about how to make modal shift a viability. We have to think about what's the population composed of in that area. Is it a lot of older people? Is it people with financial disadvantage? We have to target messages really carefully, because in the main, the poor quality of public transport reinforces its poor status. It was described as endemic in this country, the way we look down upon cyclists and public transport users. The big thing we got from this study is the perspective of age. We're dealing with people who've seen a lot of interventions, and a story that was told more than once was when an intervention is planned, there's a lot of complaints up front. Nobody's happy. A lot of protests, marshalling of the forces. 10 years on, they look back and go, no, it was great, I wouldn't change it. It's gone the right way. That, in terms of policy, is a call to arms for a certain level of boldness of action. The other thing we need to be bold about is thinking about a whole life transport system. Again, interviews with people reflecting over the life course tells you about changing needs. We need to build places that give people scope to adjust their travel habits as their personal circumstances change. We need to think about genuinely inclusive and accessible places. So what precipitates change to more sustainable travel? Well, quality of public transport, but the bar there is really high. Okay is not enough. It has to be better than the other available options. It has to seem more sensible, more practical, and crucially faster. The pull measures are quite a lot there. Simplify and reduce the time of cost of public transport. Good news, positive experiences with can be a tipping point to longer term change behaviours. So we talk a little bit about provision of active travel, provision of public transport options, and again, for our group, they are not adequate. They're not good enough. There's a perception of busier roads, of also falling standards of civility and falling standards in terms of driving and civility and parking and civility. The big push factor there is that enforcement of existing regulations for the safety of cycling and walking and parking are necessary. Why else do people make a change? A lot of it's luck, not necessarily good luck, the vicissitudes of life. Our people change because maybe they've become ill. Maybe they had to support older parents. Again, we tend to think of supporting children. What are we doing with children? A lot of us support older parents, people with health problems. We need to think about this again when we look at place and choosing policy measures. The other issue about why change came from place as well. When people moved, they changed. This isn't an unfamiliar issue, but one of the things that the stories emphasised was that exclusion is a massive issue if you move to somewhere that doesn't have adequate public transport. So firstly, think about the life course. Secondly, think about how that applies everywhere. A critical issue here, and this takes us back to the idea of need versus want, is what is actually necessary for particular people at particular times in their life. The complexity of socioeconomic factors, demographic factors, and place thrown up by these interviews is absolutely massive. You know, going back to we need something for everybody in that picture. We asked a lot about the idea of want, what makes you want to do particularly sustainable things. People get out of it health, they get out of it saving money, which is a big thing just now, and enjoyment. But we need to explore the kinds of mobility and accessibility that people need as well as want. So, the road ahead to net zero, what did we learn? Leadership from the older drivers cohort. Yes, we've learned lots of things. People take up many, many options to behave more sustainably. They are motivated to do so, but these aren't necessarily the dominant drivers. The knowledge we have from this is that multiple changes across the life course, precipitated sometimes by chance, make a big difference. We learned that positive experience of changing behaviour can put you on a pathway to more so, and emphasise that positive message is useful, but planning is a critical factor. We have to create environments that are useful for people. I'm going to end just saying, good news, we learned a lot. Not so good news. By way of being an example, what we learned was there's a long and urgent way to travel. Persuasion is not enough.